It's a real blessing to be here with you, to share this day, to recall the past, to imagine the future, and to honor the present in which we have to act on the future. And that's what I'd like to talk with you a little bit about learning leadership lessons from the past, using them to imagine the future, and acting on them in the present. So I want to say a little bit about leadership, and it's one of those words that everybody uses for so many different things. So I want to explain what I've learned about leadership, and it's best summarized by 3 questions that were posed by a first-century Jerusalem teacher named Rabbi Hillel. And he said, when you're trying to figure out what to do, how to do it, he said, ask yourself 3 questions. The first question he said to ask yourself is, if I am not for myself, who will be for me? Now, that's not a selfish question, but what it means is that if you presume to offer leadership to others, be clear about you. What are your values? What do you care for? What resources do you bring? Because you have to start in that place. But then the second question he says to ask yourself, if I am for myself alone, only for myself, what am I? Because to be a who and not a what, to be a human being is to recognize that we exist in relationship with others in the world, and that our capacity to realize our wishes are wrapped up with the capacity of others to realize theirs. We are in relationship. And finally, he says, ask yourself the question, if not now, when? It's not advice to jump into moving traffic, I don't think. But I think what it means is that if you wait until everything is perfectly ready to act, you will never act, because the future is unknown. And action always takes risk. And so finding the courage to act is how you actually, is about the only way you can begin to learn how to act effectively. Because understanding comes from action, it doesn't come before it. And sometimes in schools we get confused about that. We think we're going to study, and someday we'll be ready. One of the wonders of the Chavez clubs is that you are acting now. And by acting now, you are shaping your understanding for years to come of what it will be. So I think of leadership as the interaction of these 3, of self with other and with action. And there's one other thing about leadership that's important to recognize, which is that when do people say, where's the leadership? Do they say when everything's working? No problems, right? When do people say, where's the leadership? Problems, challenges. It's coming to terms with the fact that if you are going to lead, you are entering into a world of uncertainty, of unpredictability. And that's the nature of it. And it's challenging because it means that you ask yourself, do I have the skills for this? A challenge to your hands. Can I figure out how to deal with this? A challenge to the head. And how do I find the courage to take the risks? A challenge to the heart. And so it requires learning to cultivate the head, the hands, and the heart in order to become effective, strategic, and courageous leader. The other important thing is that Hillel posed questions, not answers, because sometimes we think leadership is about having all the answers. Forget that, nobody ever does. It's about learning the questions to ask to find the answers. So leadership is much more about learning than it is about knowing. I first asked myself these 3 questions about self and other in action when I was a junior at Harvard College in 1964. I had volunteered for the Mississippi Summer Project, and the Summer Project was an effort to bring supporters from around the United States to the state of Mississippi, which was the wall of resistance to breaking down the barriers to segregation and discrimination at that time in that state. And organizers who were trying to organize there would wind up in jail or worse, and so the idea was to bring people from outside, and that way it might bring the law to Mississippi too and enable us to register voters and organize there. And I volunteered for that, and we were all in a place called Oxford, Ohio, a school, sitting in a room kind of in a place like this, when we got word that 3 of the people we were working with had gone down to Mississippi a week before and were missing. Someone named Andy Goodman, Michael Schwerner, and James Cheney. They had been sent to investigate a church burning in Philadelphia, Mississippi, where there had been meetings for the civil rights movement, and they never came back. Bob Moses, who was the lead organizer for our project, appropriately named, called us all together in a group kind of like this, and he said, look, I got to share some news with you. 3 of our brothers who went down earlier are missing, and we don't know exactly what happened, but we think they are gone. And in fact, they were. 2 months later, their bodies were found in a levee having been beaten and tortured by Ku Klux Klan. Now, we didn't know all that, but we knew they were gone. And Bob said to us, look, I'd love to tell you, just forget about this. Just go home. But I can't. But it's got to be your choice. It's got to be your choice. We need you to go, but you've got to choose to go. And at that point, everybody was silent. I mean, I sank into my chair like, what am I doing here? This isn't what I signed up for. And you could hear everyone sort of thinking through it in the same way. And what I remembered was that my father, I grew up in Bakersfield, my father was a rabbi, but we had lived in Germany for 3 years after the Second World War when he was a chaplain in the American Army, and I'd met people whose lives had been utterly shattered by that genocidal Holocaust. People whose lives they were looking for hope somewhere, and my parents interpreted that to me as not being simply about anti-Semitism, but being about racism, and that racism kills, period. It is not a complicated question. And the civil rights movement was fighting the institutionalized racism that's been part of this country since its founding. So that was part of why I was there, and I don't know if you're a rabbi's kid or a minister's kid, you wind up having to go to all the religious stuff, you know. And you're also supposed to be perfect, which is a different set of issues that you have to deal with. But I loved the Passover Seders, which is the celebration with food of the Exodus story. The same as the Last Supper, where Jesus shared with his disciples the bread and the wine. And that story of telling a story of people finding their way out of slavery to freedom, every year I'd hear that story, and they'd point to the kids and say, you were slaves in Egypt. And I said, what are you talking about? I've never been to Egypt. I've never been a slave. Until I learned that that story wasn't the property of one people, time, or place, but it was told generation after generation, and you had to figure out where you were in it. Were you with those guys with the chariots and Pharaoh, and or were you with those people who were trying to find the land of promise for themselves? And finally, as I looked around the room, everybody was young. 19, 20. It was a young person's movement, the civil rights movement. You know that? It was a young person's movement. Dr. King, when he led the bus boycott in Montgomery, Alabama, was only 25. The young people's movement. And you know, there's something about coming of age with a critical eye on the world you find, and almost of necessity, hopeful hearts, that links generation change with social change. And so it was in my generation. I believe so it will be in your generation as well. So as we're sitting there thinking, what are we going to do? A young woman in the back, Jean Wheeler, African-American organizer with SNCC, stood up and she started to sing. They say that freedom is a constant struggle. They say freedom is a constant struggle. Oh, Lord, we struggled so long, we must be free. They say freedom is too much dying. We've died too long, we must be free. And as she stood up and sung, everybody joined behind her one by one, and the next day everybody went to Mississippi. Not a single person failed to go. Now, that was a life-changing moment for me. Because with all due respect to Harvard, my education about race, power, and politics in America began in Mississippi, not at Harvard. It was so clear, all the inequalities, housing, healthcare, education, you name it, blacks were here and whites were here. And it was also very clear that bringing a few medical supplies or some books wouldn't make much difference. And that's when I began to learn the difference between charity and justice. Charity says, what's wrong? Let me help. Justice asks, why is it happening? Let me change it. And when you start asking questions about why is it happening, let me change it, that starts making people uncomfortable. Because that's when you learn that if there's a lot of people that have a little, it's often because there's a lot fewer people that have a lot. And once you start trying to change things, guess what? You run into challenges. So the problem we realized was not a problem of education or information or understanding. It was a problem of power, of how to get the power to change that. And some people thought that you went to powerful places like Washington, D.C. to ask for power. But that didn't get anywhere, and it wasn't until we learned that unless the people with the problem also could become the source of the solution to the problem, nothing would change. You get a lot of research, you get a lot of testimony, but nothing changes. That lesson is what introduced me to organizing, and I was sort of taken with this idea that you could work with people, develop leadership to develop their leadership, bring their resources together and turn it into the power to solve the problems that they had. And so after almost 2 years in Mississippi, I was thinking of going back to school, but I wound up coming back to Bakersfield where I grew up, and Caesar had just started a grape strike there. Now, I'd grown up in Bakersfield in the middle of the farm worker world, but I hadn't seen it. I had to go to Mississippi and get what we call Mississippi eyes to come back home and see, oh, it's another community of people of color, also without political rights, also without economic protections, the labor laws provided to other workers. And of course, California has its own rich history of racial discrimination going back to its native peoples, to the Chinese, the Japanese, the Filipinos, and of course in the 1950s there were still movie theaters in LA that had Mexicans upstairs and whites downstairs. So it turned out that Mississippi was not an exception to America, it was an example of the America we needed to change. And that's why I went to work with Caesar. I worked with Caesar for the next 16 years and the farm workers. And if Mississippi was where I learned that I wanted to do organizing, the farm workers was where I really learned how to do it. It was a great school for organizing. And all of us who went through this, Caesar brought in Fred Ross to train us, who had trained Caesar in organizing. And it was a place where the craft of organizing was taken so seriously. You know, I noticed that someone said about in the Chavez clubs, the handshakes, the details, the meetings. Those details are expressions of love. Because anything excellent happens through the details. It doesn't happen with just the big ideas. And that approach to organizing, what we learned in the farm workers, you paid attention to the details. You had to get it right because that's how you showed your love for what you were doing and for the people with whom you were doing it. Now, one of my first assignments in the farm workers was to, with Chuck Gardner, plan the march to Sacramento. And boy, that was something. I want to read you just a little bit about what happened, how that march came about. Proposals flew around the room. Someone suggested we follow the example of New Mexico miners who had traveled to New York to set up a mining camp in front of the company headquarters in Wall Street. Farm workers could travel to Shenley headquarters in New York, set up a labor camp out front, and maintain a vigil until Shenley signed. Someone else then suggested they go by bus so rallies could be held all across the country, local boycott committees organized, and publicity generated, building momentum for the arrival in New York. Then why not march instead of going by bus, someone else asked, as Dr. King had the previous year, Selma to Montgomery. But it's too far from Delano to New York, someone said. On the other hand, the Shenley headquarters in San Francisco might not be too far, about 280 miles, which an Army veteran present figured could be done at the rate of 15 miles a day or in about 20 days. But what if Shenley doesn't respond, Chavez asked. Why not march to Sacramento instead and put the heat on Governor Brown, that's the father of the current Governor Brown, to intervene and get negotiations started. He's up for re-election, wants the votes of our supporters, so perhaps we can have more impact if we use him as leverage. Yes, someone else said, and on the way to Sacramento, the march could pass through most of the farm worker towns, like Roberto was saying. Taking a page from Mao Zedong's Long March, we could organize local committees and get pledges not to break the strike sign. Yes, and we could get them to feed us and house us, a smart person said. And just as Emiliano Zapata wrote his Plan de Ayala, Luis Valdez suggested we can write a Plan de Deleno. Read it in each town, ask local farm workers to sign it and to carry it to the next town. Then Chavez asked, why should it be a march at all? It will be Lent soon, a time for reflection, for penance, for asking forgiveness. Perhaps ours should be a pilgrimage, a peregrinación, which could arrive at Sacramento on Easter Sunday. That's how the idea of the march came about. Not one person, many people contributing their ideas, weaving their ideas together, and coming up with a great idea. The march began, as we said, on March 17th, and it gathered steam, and it began to build publicity and support. And by the time we got to Fresno, we had 2,000 people. And the newspapers began reporting more and more about the march. And by the time we got to Stockton, there was a phone call for Caesar from Shenley's lawyer saying, we want to negotiate a deal with you. They were so frightened that when we got to Sacramento, it would turn into a huge anti-Shenley rally, that they figured that they would cut their losses by trying to negotiate with the union. And sure enough, within 2 days, they signed the first contract in California farm labor history, raising wages, hours, working conditions, and everything for agricultural workers. Easter Vigil Saturday, we were camped at Our Lady of Grace School across the river from Sacramento, sort of, some people said, like the Israelites across the River Jordan. Planning to go into that city the next day, and there was a man named Roberto Roman, a farm worker, who had carried a 2x4 cross wrapped in black all the way from Delano. He stayed up that night, rewrapping it in white, decorating it with flowers. And the next day, he led the march across the river bridge, barefoot, bearing his cross of flowers into that city of Sacramento, where 10,000 people were waiting for us, and really launched the farm worker movement. Hurt without hope turns into despair. But hope without hurt isn't motivated. And the two, putting them together, is really where the action is in the work of social change. And think about it for a minute. How many people in this room do not have stories of hurt in their lives? If you didn't have those stories of hurt, you wouldn't think the world needed changing. But how many people here have stories of hope as well? Let me see, raise your hands if you have stories of hope. Otherwise, you wouldn't think you could change it. And cultivating that tension between the need for change and the possibility of change is where the magic is. Young people come of age with that kind of critical eye, come of age with those hopeful hearts. And the challenges are different. Our hopes may be different. The technology is certainly different. But the values that are at stake, the needs that cry out, and the responsibility to act on those needs are as great as ever. And that's the work of leadership. That has been the work of so many people in this room. It has been my work, and now it is your work. And I want to just conclude here with a song, but I won't sing. In the 4th grade, I was told, would you please just mouth the words? And so that was kind of wherever that evil teacher was. I don't know. That was sort of the end of my singing career. But this is a song that Judy Collins recorded during the Civil Rights Movement, and it uses the word freedom, but I want to explain what it means. The Civil Rights Movement never called itself the Civil Rights Movement. It called itself the Freedom Movement, because freedom was a much bigger word than legal rights. Freedom was the aspiration to live with dignity, to live with self-respect, to live in solidarity with others, to live in a world of greater equality, of greater peace. So all that was wrapped up in freedom. And the song was like this. Freedom doesn't come like a bird on the wing, doesn't fall down like the summer rain. Freedom is a hard-won thing. You have to work for it. You have to fight for it, day and night for it. And every generation has to win it again. Pass it on to your children, brother. Pass it on to your children, sister. They have to work for it. They have to fight for it day and night for it, because every generation has to win it again. Pass it on to your children. Pass it on. And I thank all of you for the opportunity to pass some of it on. Thank you very much. Hang on just a second. I have an amendment on the applause, okay? On the applause, because when we were doing a series of Latino Camp Obamas in 2008, and we were doing the farm worker applause, like the aplauso campesino, right? Like everybody knows how to do, like you did at the beginning. But there was a young woman who was organizing in the Filipino community who said, wait a second, we added something to that. And hearing your applause today, I think might be a nice way to bring it together. Here's how it goes. Come on, join me. That's it. That's it. Try it again. You got to get the timing just right, and it gives it the solidarity to go with the momentum in the other applause. So thanks very much.